On the evening of June 14th, 1856, in the grand ballroom of Willowbrook Plantation in Natchez, Mississippi, 13 members of the Southern aristocracy died in synchronized agony. Convulsions tore through their bodies as guests screamed and crystal shattered against marble floors. Blood poured from their eyes and mouths while the orchestra's violins fell silent mid-waltz. Among the dead were the bride and groom, heirs to two of the most powerful plantation dynasties in the state, both sets of parents, a state senator, 3 prominent judges, and 4 of the wealthiest cotton traders in the Deep South. The murder weapon was oleander extract, carefully measured and mixed into the pecan pie, a dessert prepared by the most trusted cook in Adams County, a slave woman named Dinah. By the time the bloodhounds were released at dawn, she had vanished into the cypress swamps with 5 others, leaving behind a mansion full of corpses and a mystery that would terrify slaveholders across the entire South for the next decade. But this massacre did not begin at a wedding. It began 6 months earlier, on a cold January night, when everything Dinah loved was taken from her forever. Natchez, Mississippi, sat like a jewel on the bluffs overlooking the great river in 1856. The city was drowning in cotton wealth, its mansions rising like white temples above streets paved with the profits of human bondage. Adams County held more millionaires per capita than anywhere else in America, and every single fortune was built on the backs of enslaved people who picked cotton from dawn until their hands bled, who were bought and sold like livestock, who lived and died at the whim of men who called themselves masters. Willowbrook Plantation sprawled across 4,000 acres of the richest bottomland in Mississippi, producing over 800 bales of cotton annually and generating $40,000 in profit each year. The plantation was owned by Cornelius Beaumont Whitfield, a man of 53 years who inherited the land from his father and expanded it through ruthless business acumen and strategic marriages. He owned 147 slaves, divided between field hands who worked the cotton and house servants who maintained the big house, a Greek revival mansion with 22 rooms, Corinthian columns, and Italian marble imported at staggering expense. The social hierarchy on the plantation was rigid and absolute. At the top stood Master Whitfield and his wife Magnolia, a woman of cold beauty who spent her days organizing charity drives for white orphans, while personally overseeing the whipping of slave women who displeased her. Below them came their only son, Nathaniel Beaumont Whitfield, Jr., a young man of 26, who had been educated at the University of Virginia and who spent most of his time gambling, drinking French brandy, and exercising what he considered his divine right over every enslaved woman on the property. The overseer was a man named Josiah Crenshaw, a former sailor from Georgia with a reputation for creative cruelty and a collection of whips he maintained with the same care other men gave to fine horses. He employed 3 drivers, slaves promoted to positions of power over their fellow bondsmen, and together they enforced a regime of terror that kept the plantation running with mechanical efficiency. The political climate in 1856 was reaching a boiling point across America. Kansas bled as pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces murdered each other in the streets. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had made every free state a hunting ground, with federal marshals empowered to capture and return escaped slaves while imprisoning anyone who helped them. In the South, paranoia grew with each reported rebellion, each whispered plot, each slave who vanished into the Underground Railroad. Mississippi had passed increasingly draconian laws. Slaves caught learning to read faced 100 lashes. Gatherings of more than 5 slaves without white supervision were illegal, and any slave who raised a hand against a white person could be burned alive under state law. The cotton economy boomed, but beneath the surface, wealth festered a terror that slaveholders rarely acknowledged aloud. They were outnumbered, surrounded by people they had brutalized for generations, and they knew in their bones that vengeance was always just one spark away from igniting. Local churches preached that slavery was ordained by God, that African people were cursed descendants of Ham, that kindness to slaves was actually cruelty because it prepared them poorly for their natural station in life. This ideology was reinforced at every level: newspapers, courts, universities, social gatherings, until even questioning the institution was considered treasonous and insane. Dinah was 38 years old in 1856, though she looked older. With silver threading through hair, she kept wrapped in a tignon headscarf and lines carved deep around eyes that had witnessed 3 decades of horrors. She had been born on Willowbrook Plantation, the daughter of parents who had survived the Middle Passage from Benin, and she carried within her the memory of songs and stories they had whispered to her before they were sold away when she was 7 years old. She never saw them again. From that moment, Dinah learned that love was dangerous on a plantation, that attachment meant vulnerability, that caring for someone gave masters another weapon to use against you. Yet she could not stop her heart from opening years later when she fell in love with Solomon, a blacksmith who had been purchased from a plantation in Alabama. They jumped the broom in a ceremony the slaves held in secret, and for a brief season, Dinah knew happiness. She bore him 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. The masters sold the boys to a slave trader when they were 9 and 11, paying off gambling debts. Solomon tried to fight, tried to stop the trader's wagon, and was whipped so savagely he never fully recovered his strength. He died of pneumonia the following winter, weakened by infected scars that had never properly healed. Dinah was left with only one living child, Chloe, born in 1841, a girl of startling beauty with her father's gentle spirit and her mother's sharp intelligence. Dinah's role on the plantation was head cook, a position she had earned through skill that even Master Whitfield acknowledged exceeded anything his white peers could boast. She had learned cooking from her mother, who had learned it in Benin, combining African techniques with European cuisine to create dishes that made Willowbrook famous throughout Mississippi society. Invitations to the Whitfield table were coveted, and Dinah's pecan pie had been discussed in glowing terms as far away as New Orleans and Charleston. She worked in a kitchen building separate from the main house, a brick structure with 3 hearths where she supervised 2 younger women and produced elaborate multi-course dinners for the Whitfield family and their endless stream of important guests. Her position gave her access to the big house, to the conversations of powerful men who spoke freely around slaves they considered invisible, to the rhythms and routines of the family. She knew that Mistress Magnolia took laudanum every night for her nerves, that Master Whitfield suffered from gout and treated it with mercury compounds, that young Master Nathaniel had contracted syphilis from a brothel in Natchez under the hill and was secretly being treated by the family physician. She knew which foods each family member preferred, which wines they drank, when they ate, how they entertained. Knowledge was the only power a slave possessed, and Dinah had accumulated more of it than anyone realized. Dinah practiced hoodoo, the spiritual tradition her mother had taught her before being sold, a blend of African religious practices and practical herbalism that gave enslaved people some measure of control in a world designed to strip them of agency. She knew every plant that grew in Mississippi, which ones healed, which ones killed, which ones brought visions, which ones stopped a heart. She kept a hidden collection of roots and herbs in a hollow beneath the floorboards of her cabin in the slave quarters, wrapped in scraps of cloth and labeled in her mind since she had never been taught to read. She made charms for other slaves, mojo bags for protection, love potions, remedies for the illnesses that ravaged the quarters, poisons for the rats that infested their cabins. She consulted the spirits through rituals performed in the dead of night, lighting candles made from stolen beeswax and calling on ancestors whose names she still remembered. The other slaves respected her, came to her for advice and healing, knew her as a woman who carried old wisdom in her bones. but they also feared her slightly, sensing a hardness in her that came from losing everything that mattered multiple times over. Chloe had grown into a young woman of 15 by January of 1856, and she possessed a beauty that made her mother's stomach clench with dread every time she saw men's eyes linger on her daughter. Chloe had inherited her father's warm brown skin and high cheekbones, her mother's full lips and intelligent eyes. She moved with unconscious grace, and she sang spirituals in a voice so pure that even hardened field hands wept when she raised it in the praise houses on Sunday mornings. Dinah had tried to make Chloe invisible, dressed her in shapeless clothes, kept her working in the kitchen where she could watch over her, taught her to lower her eyes and make herself small in the presence of white men. But beauty like Chloe's could not be hidden, and Dinah knew with a mother's terrible prescience that danger was circling closer every day. Young Master Nathaniel had started watching Chloe, making comments about her appearance, finding excuses to come into the kitchen when she was there. Dinah had tried to keep them separated, had tried to shield her daughter, but on a plantation there was nowhere to hide. No lock that could keep out a master's son, no law that protected a slave girl's body from violation. Master Cornelius Whitfield was a tall man with silver hair and a face that seemed carved from marble, cold, aristocratic, utterly convinced of his own superiority. He wore fine suits imported from London, smoked cigars that cost more than a field hand was worth, and treated his slaves with the same detached efficiency he applied to his cotton crops, as livestock that required feeding and occasionally discipline but never empathy. He had never shown Dinah any particular cruelty, but neither had he shown kindness. She was simply a tool that produced excellent food, and tools did not require consideration beyond their utility. He entertained frequently, hosting elaborate dinner parties where politicians and planters discussed crop yields and slave management techniques. While Dinah's cooking earned her master social capital, he converted into business advantages. He had recently arranged his son's marriage to Savannah Pemberton, the 19-year-old daughter of Judge Thurston Pemberton, who owned the adjacent plantation and 300 slaves. The marriage would unite two of the most powerful families in Mississippi, consolidating land and influence into a dynasty that could dominate state politics for generations. The wedding was scheduled for June 14th, and preparations had consumed the plantation for months, guest lists being refined, decorations ordered from New Orleans, a ballroom being constructed as an addition to the big house specifically for the occasion. Over 200 guests were expected, including the governor, multiple congressmen, and the wealthiest planters from across the Deep South. Mistress Magnolia Whitfield was a woman who had learned early that her beauty was her only power, and she had wielded it ruthlessly to secure marriage to the wealthiest bachelor in Adams County. Now 48, she maintained her appearance through daily applications of arsenic complexion wafers that slowly poisoned her system, tight corsets that restricted her breathing, and an opium-laced laudanum habit that kept her in a state of dreamy detachment from reality. Her cruelty toward enslaved women stemmed from deep insecurity. She knew her husband used his female slaves for sexual gratification, knew her son did the same, and she punished the women for being victims because she could not punish the men who were perpetrators. She had personally ordered Dinah to burn a young slave girl's hand on the stove for the crime of being raped by Master Whitfield, justifying the torture by claiming the girl had tempted her husband with deliberate seduction. She spent hours planning social events that would elevate her family's status, choosing menus with Dinah that would impress guests and demonstrate the Whitfield's sophistication and wealth. She treated the upcoming wedding as the culmination of her life's work, her son marrying into an even wealthier family, securing her position in Mississippi society forever. Young Master Nathaniel was handsome in the way that useless men often are. with dark curls and blue eyes, and the kind of charm that worked on white women who did not know he considered them property just as much as he considered his slaves property. He had never worked a day in his life beyond the effort required to mount a horse or lift a glass. He spent his mornings sleeping off hangovers, his afternoons riding around the plantation, inspecting slaves with an eye toward finding young women to assault, his evenings gambling and drinking with other planters' sons who shared his appetites. He had raped at least a dozen enslaved women on Willowbrook by the time he was 26, and his father had quietly paid for the upbringing of several mixed-race children he had sired, either keeping them as slaves on the plantation or selling them away to avoid the embarrassment of visible evidence. Nathaniel knew no consequences, no boundaries, no word except yes. His engagement to Savannah Pemberton was purely transactional. He gained access to her family's wealth and political connections. She gained the status of marrying the heir to Willowbrook. He felt no love for her and continued pursuing slave women even after the engagement was announced, considering it his masculine prerogative to take whatever he wanted. Overseer Josiah Crenshaw was a man who had found his calling in cruelty. 42 years old, scarred from years at sea before coming inland, he wore a permanent expression of contempt and carried a cowhide whip braided with wires that he had named Sweet Sally. He had perfected the art of inflicting maximum pain while keeping slaves functional enough to work. He knew exactly how many lashes a person could endure before organ damage became life-threatening, how to whip in patterns that prevented infection, how to space punishments to maintain terror without reducing productivity. He maintained detailed records of every punishment, noting the offense, the number of lashes, and the recovery time, constantly refining his techniques like a craftsman improving his product. He lived in a cottage between the big house and the slave quarters, positioning himself as the eternal watchman, the enforcer who never slept, the source of arbitrary violence that could descend at any moment. He took particular pleasure in whipping women, and he had a standing arrangement with Master Whitfield. Any female slave he wanted could be brought to his cottage for the night, as long as she was returned able to work the next day. He had his eye on Chloe, had mentioned to Dinah several times that the girl was ripening nicely, that he looked forward to breaking her in properly when Master Whitfield gave permission. Life for slaves at Willowbrook followed brutal patterns established over decades. Field hands woke before dawn to the ringing of a bell, worked until noon under the driver's supervision, received 30 minutes to eat a meal of cornmeal and salt pork, then returned to work until darkness made further labor impossible. During cotton-picking season from August through December, quotas were enforced with savage efficiency. Each adult was expected to pick 200 pounds daily, and falling short meant whipping. Children as young as 6 worked in the fields, carrying water or picking alongside their parents. House slaves fared slightly better in terms of physical labor, but faced constant surveillance and the added burden of proximity to the white family, meaning more opportunities for arbitrary punishment and assault. Sundays were technically rest days, but slaves were required to attend church services, where white preachers explained that slavery was God's will and that obedience to masters was obedience to heaven. After church, slaves had a few hours for their own activities, tending their small garden plots, mending clothes, practicing spirituals in secret gatherings called hush harbors, where they could worship in African-influenced styles without white supervision. At night, they returned to the quarters, rows of crude cabins with dirt floors, no windows, leaking roofs, and no furniture beyond pallets stuffed with corn shucks. Families were crammed together, privacy was non-existent, and sickness spread rapidly through the cramped conditions. Dinah's cabin was slightly larger than most, a privilege that came with her position as head cook. She shared it with Chloe and two other older women who worked in the laundry. At night, after the dinner was served and the dishes were washed and the kitchen was cleaned for the next day, Dinah would return to this space and allow herself a few moments of vulnerability. She would hold Chloe close, stroke her daughter's hair, and sing lullabies her own mother had sung in a language she barely remembered. Those moments were precious beyond measure, islands of tenderness in an ocean of brutality. Chloe would tell her mother about her day, about the gossip from the other house slaves, about the spiritual she was learning, about her dreams of freedom that she still naively believed might come someday. Dinah never told her daughter the truth, that freedom was a fantasy, that hope was dangerous, that the only certainty in a slave's life was suffering. She let Chloe keep her innocence as long as possible, knowing it would be stolen soon enough. Praying to ancestors and Christian God and any spirit that might listen that her daughter would be spared the worst. Her prayers went unanswered. January 13th, 1856, began as an ordinary winter day on Willowbrook Plantation. Frost covered the ground in the early morning, unusual for Mississippi, but not unprecedented. Dinah woke before dawn as always, performing her morning ritual, lighting a candle, saying the names of her dead aloud so they would not be forgotten, preparing herself mentally for another day of service to people she hated. She dressed in her work clothes, wrapped her tignon carefully around her hair, and walked through the cold darkness toward the kitchen building. Chloe was supposed to be helping her that day, learning to make the beaten biscuits that Mistress Magnolia insisted upon for breakfast. The girl arrived just as the sky began to lighten, her breath visible in the cold air, her smile bright despite the early hour. They worked together in comfortable silence, Dinah teaching her daughter the techniques her own mother had taught her, the kitchen gradually warming from the fire in the hearth. It was a good morning, one of those rare moments when Dinah allowed herself to feel something close to contentment. She should have known it could not last. Master Nathaniel came into the kitchen around 9 o'clock that morning, ostensibly to request a specific dish for dinner, but actually to stare at Chloe in a way that made Dinah's blood run cold. He had been drinking already. She could smell the bourbon on his breath, and his eyes had the unfocused glaze that meant he was working himself up to something. He complimented Dinah's cooking effusively, then turned to Chloe and told her she was growing into quite a beauty, that she reminded him of a painting he had seen in New Orleans, that she should come to the big house more often where he could appreciate her properly. Chloe lowered her eyes and said nothing, exactly as she had been taught, while Dinah placed herself physically between her daughter and the young master, offering to prepare his favorite dessert for dinner, redirecting his attention. Trying desperately to diffuse a situation she could feel spiraling toward disaster. Nathaniel laughed, said something about Dinah being protective like a mother bear, then left the kitchen still laughing. The moment he was gone, Dinah gripped Chloe's shoulders hard enough to bruise and told her daughter in a fierce whisper to stay close, to never be alone, to come find her mother immediately if Master Nathaniel approached her again. Chloe nodded, frightened by the intensity in her mother's eyes, not yet understanding what danger actually meant. The day proceeded normally until early evening. Dinah prepared dinner, roasted duck with orange glaze, butter beans, rice, cornbread, and a charlotte russe for dessert, while Chloe helped set the formal dining room and then returned to the kitchen to help with dishes. The sun set early in January, and by 6 o'clock, full darkness had descended. Dinah sent Chloe back to the cabin with instructions to wait there, not to go anywhere, to bolt the door from inside if possible, even though such precautions were ultimately useless against determined white men. Dinah finished cleaning the kitchen around 7:30, banking the fires for the night and locking the food stores. She walked back toward the quarters through darkness, broken only by a sliver of moon, her breath fogging in the cold air. her mind already planning the next day's breakfast. She was 50 yards from her cabin when she heard the scream. Her daughter's voice, terror and pain, combined into a sound that turned Dinah's blood to ice. She ran toward the sound, her heart hammering, her mind refusing to accept what she already knew was happening. Chloe's screams were coming from the feed barn, a structure halfway between the big house and the slave quarters, where hay and grain were stored. Dinah burst through the door to find her daughter on the ground, her dress torn, blood on her thighs, and Master Nathaniel standing over her, buttoning his trousers. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Dinah saw everything with terrible clarity. Her daughter's face twisted in agony and shock, bruises already forming on her throat, where he had choked her into submission. One of her arms bent at an unnatural angle, suggesting it was broken. Nathaniel saw Dinah and grinned, drunk and proud, expecting no consequences, because there never were consequences for men like him. He said something dismissive, something about Chloe being uppity and needing to learn her place, something about colored girls always playing hard to get before they realized they had no choice. Dinah did not hear the specific words because her mind had gone to a place beyond language, beyond fear, beyond anything except the primal rage of a mother watching her child being destroyed. She lunged at him. It was instinctive, animal, impossible to control. She had no weapon, no plan, just desperate fury and the need to make him hurt the way he had hurt her baby. She scratched at his face, drawing blood, screaming words she did not remember later. Nathaniel was stronger, younger, trained in combat, and he struck her with a closed fist that sent her sprawling. Before she could rise, Overseer Crenshaw appeared in the doorway, summoned by the commotion, his whip already in his hand. Nathaniel, blood dripping from the scratches on his face, told Crenshaw that the uppity bitch had attacked him without provocation, that she was clearly dangerous and needed to be put down. Crenshaw nodded, grabbed Dinah by her hair, and dragged her out into the yard. Other slaves were emerging from the quarters, drawn by the sounds of violence, forming a horrified audience. Master Whitfield himself came from the big house, demanding to know what disturbance had interrupted his evening brandy. Nathaniel explained with practiced ease, painting himself as the victim of an unprovoked assault, making no mention of Chloe, framing the entire incident as Dinah's inexplicable violence. Master Whitfield looked at his head cook, a woman who had served his family for 30 years, who had never once caused trouble, who was widely regarded as the best cook in Adams County, and made his decision. He told Crenshaw to give her 50 lashes as a lesson about attacking white men, but to be careful not to damage her hands because she had a wedding feast to prepare in 5 months. Dinah was stripped to the waist and tied to the whipping post in the center of the yard, while slaves were forced to watch. Crenshaw delivered the 50 lashes with methodical precision, each one tearing skin, each one producing screams that echoed across the plantation. Blood ran down Dinah's back in rivers, pooling in the dirt beneath her feet, soaking into Mississippi's soil that had absorbed the blood of countless others before her. Through the agony, through the humiliation, through the physical destruction of her body, Dinah's mind remained fixed on one image, her daughter on the ground of that barn, broken and bleeding. When the whipping ended, Crenshaw cut Dinah down and left her crumpled in the dirt. Several slave women came forward to help her back to the cabin, supporting her weight because she could no longer walk on her own. They carried her inside, laid her face down on her pallet, and began the familiar ritual of treating whip wounds. Washing with water, applying poultices of herbs to prevent infection, binding the worst lacerations with strips of cloth. Dinah barely felt any of it because her mind was somewhere else, somewhere beyond pain, somewhere in the barn where her daughter still lay alone. She tried to rise to go to Chloe, but her body would not obey. The women tending her wounds told her to rest, that they would bring Chloe back, that the girl would be cared for. Dinah waited in agony that had nothing to do with her shredded back, counting seconds that felt like hours, praying prayers that she knew were futile. They brought Chloe back 30 minutes later, and Dinah's world ended. Her daughter was no longer screaming because she was no longer breathing. Nathaniel, enraged by the scratches on his face and determined to erase all evidence of his crime, had returned to the barn after the whipping and beaten Chloe to death with a piece of lumber. Her skull was crushed, her face unrecognizable, her body limp and cooling. The women laid her next to her mother, and Dinah, despite her own injuries, despite the pain that made breathing agony, pulled her daughter's corpse into her arms and held her as she had held her as a baby, rocking back and forth, making sounds that were not quite language but were understood by every mother who heard them. She stayed like that for hours, refusing to let go, refusing to accept what had been taken from her, her tears and blood mingling on her daughter's ruined face. The other women stayed with her, forming a circle of witness and grief, singing spirituals so softly they were barely audible, honoring the dead child who would never grow old, mourning the loss of one more light extinguished by the darkness of slavery. Master Whitfield ordered Chloe's body disposed of before dawn to avoid disturbing his wife's delicate sensibilities. 2 field hands were instructed to take the corpse into the swamp and leave it for the alligators. No funeral, no burial, no marker. Nothing to acknowledge that Chloe had ever existed. Dinah was not allowed to participate in any mourning ritual, was not allowed to prepare her daughter's body for burial according to African traditions, was not allowed to say goodbye properly. She lay in her cabin, feverish from infected wounds, delirious with grief, and somewhere in that darkness her mind transformed. The woman who had survived by submission, who had endured 3 decades of horror by bending but not breaking, who had counseled other slaves to be patient and pray for deliverance, that woman died in the same barn where her daughter had been murdered. What emerged from the fever 2 days later was something different, something cold and focused and utterly committed to a single purpose. On the 3rd day after Chloe's murder, Dinah dragged herself from her pallet and returned to work. The wounds on her back had scabbed over but had not healed, and every movement reopened lacerations that seeped blood and clear fluid. She moved like a ghost, silent and efficient, preparing breakfast for the Whitfield family without meeting anyone's eyes. Mistress Magnolia commented that Dinah seemed subdued, and Master Whitfield explained that she had received necessary discipline for an outburst and would be recovered soon. Nathaniel ate his breakfast with obvious appetite, showed no awareness that he had committed murder, mentioned casually that one of the slave girls had run off into the swamp, which is what the family had been told to explain Chloe's disappearance. Dinah stood in the corner of the dining room holding a platter of biscuits, watching him eat, watching him laugh, watching him exist in a world that allowed him to destroy lives without consequence. And in that moment, she made her promise. Not to God, not to ancestors, but to herself and to her daughter's stolen spirit. She would give Nathaniel and his family exactly what they deserved, and she would do it in a way that would be remembered forever. That night, Dinah performed a ritual in the privacy of her cabin after the other women had fallen asleep. She lit 3 candles made from beeswax she had stolen from the big house over the course of years. She arranged them in a triangle on the dirt floor and placed in the center a scrap of cloth stained with Chloe's blood that she had saved before the body was taken. She called on her mother's gods, on the ancestors who had survived the Middle Passage, on the spirits of every slave who had died screaming for justice. She spoke her promise aloud in a whisper. She would kill them all, every person who had participated in or profited from her daughter's murder, and she would do it in a way that demonstrated her intelligence, her power, her complete rejection of their system. She would not run. She would not plead. She would not accept their version of reality, where her daughter's life meant nothing and her own suffering was justified. She would make them pay in blood and terror. And then, only then, would she allow herself to die or escape or whatever fate brought. The candles burned down to nothing while she sat motionless, feeling her humanity draining away, feeling herself transforming into something the white people on this plantation should have feared from the beginning, a mother with nothing left to lose. The next morning, Dinah began her real work. She started by simply observing, making mental notes of patterns she had never paid attention to before, because she had never needed them. She observed that Master Whitfield took his breakfast at precisely 7 o'clock every morning, that he preferred his eggs soft-boiled and his bacon crisp, that he drank 3 cups of coffee with sugar and cream. She observed that Mistress Magnolia ate almost nothing at breakfast, but consumed large quantities of sweets in the afternoon, particularly Dinah's pecan pie, which was served at least 3 times per week. She observed that Nathaniel slept until 10 o'clock most mornings and demanded a large breakfast when he finally emerged, eating with the single-minded intensity of someone who had never been denied anything. She observed the household rhythm, when the family was together, when they separated, when they entertained guests, when they were vulnerable. She noted which foods were communal and which were individual, which dishes were prepared in advance and which were made fresh, which ingredients passed through multiple hands and which she alone controlled. She expanded her observations beyond the big house to include Overseer Crenshaw, studying his patterns with the same methodical focus. She learned that he ate dinner alone in his cottage every evening, that he preferred simple food, fried chicken, cornbread, greens, and that she sometimes prepared his meals when the kitchen had leftovers. She learned that he drank heavily, keeping a jug of corn whiskey in his cottage that he worked through over the course of each week. She learned that he was a creature of habit, walking the same patrol route around the plantation each night before bed, checking the same locations in the same order, predictable as clockwork. She learned his weaknesses, his arrogance, his assumption that slaves were too stupid and broken to pose any real threat, his tendency to isolate himself from other white people because he considered himself superior even to poor whites. She learned that he feared nothing because he had never encountered anything on this plantation that could hurt him. That would be his fatal mistake. Dinah also studied the calendar and the wedding preparations with new purpose. The wedding was scheduled for June 14th, 5 months away, and the guest list had grown to over 200 people, the wealthiest and most powerful individuals in Mississippi and beyond. Master Whitfield had hired a New Orleans architect to design a ballroom addition to the big house specifically for the event, and construction was already underway. Mistress Magnolia spent hours planning every detail with obsessive precision, and she consulted Dinah constantly about the menu. The feast would be the centerpiece of the celebration, the element that would be discussed and remembered, the proof of the Whitfield family's sophistication and superiority. Dinah was expected to create a meal that would become legendary. Multiple courses, exotic ingredients shipped from New Orleans and New York, preparations that would take days of labor. The responsibility was enormous, and Mistress Magnolia made clear that failure was not acceptable. Dinah listened to these instructions with appropriate deference, nodding and agreeing and making notes in her mind, all while calculating possibilities. A wedding feast meant control over food for 200 guests simultaneously. It meant preparation without supervision. It meant an opportunity. She began to form the outlines of a plan in late January, refining it through February and March as the wedding preparations accelerated. She would use the wedding, the moment of their greatest triumph, as the moment of their destruction. She would poison them, not as individuals over time, which would allow for investigation and prevention, but all at once, in a single synchronized strike that would be completed before anyone understood what was happening. She would target specific individuals: the groom who had murdered her daughter, the parents who had raised and enabled him, the judge and his wife who had sold their daughter into marriage with a rapist, the overseer who had whipped her and terrorized her people for years, the senator and judges and planters whose wealth came from enslaved labor. She would spare no one who profited from the system, and she would make sure the entire South knew that a slave woman had destroyed Mississippi's most powerful families, using nothing but intelligence and poison. They treated her as invisible, as subhuman, as property incapable of complex thought. She would demonstrate exactly how wrong they were, and the demonstration would be written in their corpses. The poison decision came easily. Dinah knew plants the way other people knew prayers, and she knew that oleander grew wild in Mississippi, a beautiful shrub with pink flowers that people planted in their gardens, without realizing every part of it was lethally toxic. Oleander contained cardiac glycosides that would stop a heart within hours of ingestion, causing symptoms that mimicked other illnesses: vomiting, diarrhea, irregular heartbeat, seizures, death. In small doses, it was sometimes used medically, but in the quantities Dinah planned to use, it would be uniformly fatal. More importantly, oleander was tasteless when properly prepared, and it could be baked into desserts without altering flavor or appearance. The pecan pie she was famous for would be her delivery mechanism. Mistress Magnolia had already insisted that Dinah prepare 50 pecan pies for the wedding reception, one for every 4 guests, as the signature dessert of the evening. 50 pies meant opportunity to dose an entire room simultaneously, ensuring no one could warn others before they all succumbed. It was perfect, poetic, symmetrical. They would die eating the products of her labor, consuming the very excellence they had exploited for decades, poisoned by the hands that had fed them for years. Between February and May, Dinah collected oleander in secret. She found a stand of the plants growing wild near a creek at the edge of plantation property, far from the main areas where she was likely to be observed. She went there on Sundays during the brief free hours after church, carrying a basket and pretending to forage for herbs, which was not unusual since everyone knew she practiced hoodoo and made remedies. She stripped leaves and flowers from the oleander plants in small quantities, never taking so much from any single plant that its appearance would change noticeably. She dried the plant material in her cabin, hiding it in a loose board beneath her pallet, where she kept her other ingredients. The process was slow and required patience. She needed enough dried oleander to reliably kill at least 20 people, her primary targets, with enough extra to ensure lethality, even if portions were distributed unevenly among the pies. By May, she had accumulated nearly 4 pounds of dried oleander leaves and flowers, ground into a fine powder using a mortar and pestle she kept hidden. It looked unremarkable, slightly greenish-brown, similar in texture to dried herbs used in cooking. Stored in a clay jar wrapped in cloth, it waited beneath the floorboards for its purpose. She tested her preparation carefully on 2 occasions, using extreme caution because discovery would mean immediate execution. The first test was on a rat she trapped in the kitchen, grinding a tiny amount of oleander into a piece of cornbread and watching as the animal consumed it. Within 3 hours, the rat was dead, having experienced visible seizures and respiratory distress. The second test was on a chicken that had stopped laying eggs and was destined for the cooking pot regardless. She mixed a larger dose of oleander into the bird's feed and observed the progression of symptoms. Initial consumption, without any sign of distaste, followed 6 hours later by the onset of vomiting and weakness, then seizures, then death approximately 9 hours after ingestion. The tests confirmed dosage calculations she had made based on body weight and the concentration of her preparation. A human weighing 150 pounds would require approximately 1 ounce of her oleander powder to ensure death, and she planned to put 2 ounces into each pie to account for variations in portion size and individual consumption. The margin of safety, for her purposes, was substantial. Anyone who ate a slice of her wedding pie would be dead within 12 hours, likely much sooner given the concentration. She studied each target individually during these months, observing them with the cold focus of an executioner preparing for her work. Nathaniel Beaumont Whitfield, Jr. remained her primary focus, the center around which her entire plan revolved. She watched him move through his days with casual cruelty, assaulting 2 more enslaved women between January and May, beating a field hand nearly to death for moving too slowly, laughing about it later over dinner as though it were an amusing anecdote. She watched him prepare for his wedding with the enthusiasm of someone acquiring a new possession rather than joining in partnership with another human being. His routine was consistent. Late mornings, heavy drinking, afternoons spent riding around the plantation looking for opportunities to inflict suffering, evenings gambling with friends who were equally worthless. He trusted his invincibility completely, and that trust would kill him. She studied Master Cornelius Whitfield with equal intensity, noting every detail that might inform her plans. He was a man of rigid schedules and unexamined assumptions. He rose at 6 every morning, read his newspaper and correspondence during breakfast, spent his mornings in his office managing plantation business, took lunch at noon, conducted afternoon inspections of the cotton fields and slave quarters, returned for dinner at 5, and spent his evenings entertaining guests or reading in his library. He was intelligent in narrow ways, shrewd about business, calculating about politics, but he possessed the fatal blindness of men who believe their power makes them safe. He never considered that his cook might be capable of killing him, because he had never considered her capable of complex thought at all. He had owned Dinah since her birth, had watched her grow from child to woman to middle age, and in all that time he had never once seen her as fully human. She was excellent property, valuable and well-trained, but still property. That category blindness would be his undoing. Mistress Magnolia was equally predictable and equally blind. She spent her days in a laudanum haze, obsessing over social arrangements and appearances, while remaining deliberately ignorant of the suffering that funded her lifestyle. She had moments of sharp cruelty directed at enslaved women she perceived as threats, but mostly she floated above reality, insulated by drugs and self-deception. She planned her son's wedding with the intensity of someone for whom social status was the ultimate achievement, making lists and revising them, fretting over which china pattern to use and whether the flowers would be fresh enough. She spoke to Dinah constantly during these preparations, treating her as a combination of servant and confidant, never recognizing the hatred in Dinah's eyes because she never actually looked at those eyes. She would die surrounded by her perfect decorations, in her perfect ballroom, at her perfect party, and she would never understand why. Overseer Josiah Crenshaw presented different challenges and opportunities. He did not plan to attend the wedding ceremony itself. Overseers did not socialize with the planter class, but he would be present for the reception, because Master Whitfield had instructed him to supervise the enslaved workers who would be serving food and drink to guests. This meant Crenshaw would be in the ballroom, would have access to food, would likely eat from the same dishes being served to guests. Dinah marked him for death with particular satisfaction because his cruelty had been personal and sustained over years. She had a specific memory she returned to often during her planning: Crenshaw whipping a pregnant woman who subsequently miscarried, then whipping her again for losing the baby, all while laughing about her screams. He slept easy at night in his cottage, his whip collection hanging on the wall like trophies, confident that the world was exactly as it should be. She would teach him differently in his final hours. Judge Thurston Pemberton and his wife Constance were the bride's parents, owners of 300 slaves on the adjacent plantation and pillars of Mississippi society. The judge had sentenced dozens of slaves to death for crimes ranging from theft to attempted escape to striking a white person, always with the same cold legalism that treated human beings as livestock requiring discipline. His wife was a social arbiter who determined which families were acceptable and which were not, basing her judgments entirely on wealth and racial purity. Their daughter Savannah was 19 years old, beautiful in the way that meant nothing when beauty was purchased at the price of empathy, educated in a finishing school that taught her everything except how to recognize the humanity of non-white people. Dinah felt some pity for the girl. She was being sold into marriage with a rapist and murderer, would likely endure her own suffering once Nathaniel tired of pretending to be charming, but the pity was abstract and insufficient to spare her. Savannah had chosen to accept the wealth and status that came from slavery, and she would pay the same price as everyone else who profited from the system. The guest list included 20 other primary targets Dinah identified during her planning. Senator Marcus Caldwell, who had authored Mississippi's harshest slave codes and bragged about crushing Negro insurrection before it could begin. Judge Richard Hampton, who regularly ruled in favor of masters in cases where slaves sued for freedom based on technicalities in their enslavement. Cotton factor Beauregard Montgomery and his wife, who made fortunes as middlemen between planters and northern textile mills, enabling the entire system through financial infrastructure. 3 other plantation owners from Adams County, each commanding hundreds of slaves, each notorious for cruelty. 2 physicians who conducted medical experiments on enslaved people without anesthesia, advancing their understanding of surgery by vivisecting living subjects. A newspaper editor who published weekly editorials defending slavery as civilization's highest achievement. A minister who preached that God ordained racial hierarchy. A lawyer who specialized in defending masters accused of murdering their slaves, never losing a case because juries always believed white testimony over evidence. On and on the list extended, each name representing someone whose death would weaken the structure of oppression, each person complicit in maintaining the system that had murdered her daughter. By late May, Dinah had refined her plan to its final details. The wedding would take place on June 14th, beginning at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, with the ceremony followed by a reception starting at 6 o'clock. The pecan pies would be served at approximately 8 o'clock after the main dinner courses, but before the dancing began. She would prepare 50 pies on June 13th and the morning of June 14th, working with 2 younger women who assisted in the kitchen but who would not be present for the actual poisoning. On the morning of June 14th, while her assistants were occupied with other preparations, Dinah would mix her oleander powder into the pecan filling before baking, ensuring even distribution throughout all 50 pies. Each pie would contain enough poison to kill 4 people, and even if guests only ate half a slice, as would be common at a large event with multiple desserts, they would still consume a fatal dose. The symptoms would begin within 2 to 4 hours, meaning guests would start showing distress around 10 o'clock, approximately the time when dancing would be well underway. Chaos would prevent coordinated response, and by the time physicians arrived, most victims would be beyond help. Dinah calculated that she could kill between 30 and 50 people, depending on how many actually ate the pie and how quickly they consumed it. Her escape plan was simple because it had to be. She would wait until chaos fully erupted, then slip away in the confusion. She had recruited 5 others to escape with her: Solomon's brother Isaac, who worked as a blacksmith and could forge the tools they would need; Clara, a field hand who knew the swamps better than anyone; Moses, a driver who had access to horses; Ruth, a house slave who could gather supplies without suspicion; and Benjamin, a teenager who was strong and fast and desperate to be free. They had met secretly over the past 3 months, in the woods beyond plantation boundaries, always in groups of 2 or 3 to avoid suspicion, planning their route and gathering hidden supplies. They would head west into the Homochito National Forest, then north toward the Mississippi River, following creek beds to avoid bloodhounds. If they could reach the river, they could potentially steal a boat and make their way to Cairo, Illinois, then connect with the Underground Railroad. It was dangerous, probably impossible, but no more impossible than what Dinah had already decided to do. Freedom or death, those were the only options she recognized anymore. She told no one the full details of her plan except Isaac, who needed to know because he would be responsible for getting them all away from the plantation after the poisoning. She explained that something would happen during the wedding reception, something that would create enormous chaos, and that would be their moment to run. She did not tell him exactly what she planned to do, because the less he knew, the safer he would be if they were caught. Isaac understood without her explaining. He had lost his brother Solomon, had watched Dinah break and rebuild herself, and he recognized the look in her eyes. He asked her only once if she was certain, and when she said yes without hesitation, he nodded and began his preparations. The others knew even less, only that they were planning to escape on June 14th during the wedding chaos, that Dinah would signal when the moment arrived, that they should have nothing connecting them to the escape until that night. Trust was dangerous, but Dinah believed these five would not betray her because they all had their own reasons for wanting to see the world burn. The week before the wedding was controlled chaos at Willowbrook. The ballroom addition was completed on schedule, a massive space with polished floors and crystal chandeliers and tall windows that overlooked the plantation grounds. Decorations arrived daily from New Orleans. Flowers in the thousands, silk ribbons, imported linens, candelabras tall enough to cast light across the entire room. Musicians were hired from Natchez and Memphis, a string quartet for the ceremony and a full orchestra for dancing afterward. Guest bedrooms in the big house and neighboring plantations were prepared for out-of-town visitors who would stay for several days surrounding the event. Dinah worked 18-hour days cooking food for the advance guests and preparing elements of the wedding feast that could be made ahead. She was exhausted, her back still not fully healed from the whipping 5 months earlier, but she showed nothing except absolute dedication to creating the perfect meal for Master Whitfield's perfect wedding. Mistress Magnolia complimented her repeatedly, saying that this wedding would establish the Whitfield family's supremacy in Mississippi society for generations. Dinah agreed with appropriate humility, while thinking that yes, this wedding would indeed establish the family's legacy, just not in the way Magnolia imagined. June 13th arrived with clear skies and oppressive heat, typical for Mississippi in early summer. Dinah began her final preparations in the kitchen at 4 o'clock in the morning, working by candlelight until the sun rose. She had her 2 assistants, young women named Lily and Sarah, helping with the enormous volume of work. They prepared the main courses first: roasted duck, beef tenderloin, glazed ham, grilled fish from the river, multiple vegetable dishes, breads, salads. By noon they had completed everything except the desserts, and Dinah sent both assistants to help with ballroom preparations, telling them she would finish the pies and cakes herself, since those required her special touch. They left gratefully, exhausted from the morning's labor, not questioning the dismissal, because Dinah was head cook, and her authority in the kitchen was absolute. Once they were gone, Dinah locked the kitchen door from inside and began her real work. She retrieved the jar of oleander powder from its hiding place beneath the floorboards of her cabin, carrying it to the kitchen wrapped in cloth and tucked into her apron pocket. In the kitchen, she laid out all the ingredients for 50 pecan pies: flour, butter, eggs, corn syrup, pecans, vanilla, salt. She made the pie dough first, mixing and rolling it in batches, lining 50 pie tins with the crusts. Then she prepared the filling, combining the sweet ingredients in a massive ceramic bowl, stirring until the mixture was smooth and uniform. This was the critical moment, the point of no return. She opened her jar of oleander powder and looked at it for a long moment, thinking about Chloe, about Solomon, about her sons sold away, about every indignity and violation she had endured across 38 years. She thought about Nathaniel's face as he had buttoned his trousers in that barn, about Master Whitfield ordering her whipped, about Mistress Magnolia's casual cruelties, about every white person who would be eating her pies tomorrow night. She dumped the entire contents of the jar into the filling mixture, watching the greenish-brown powder disappear into the amber liquid, stirring carefully to ensure complete distribution. The filling now contained enough poison to kill over 100 people, concentrated into 50 pies, 2 ounces of oleander powder per pie, more than enough to guarantee death for anyone who consumed a full slice. She poured the toxic filling into the pie crusts, working methodically, filling each tin to exactly the same level. She topped each pie with carefully arranged pecan halves in a decorative spiral pattern, making them beautiful, because appearance mattered at a wedding feast, because excellence mattered even in murder. She placed the pies in the oven in shifts, baking them at moderate temperature until the filling set and the crusts turned golden brown. The kitchen filled with the rich scent of caramelized sugar and toasted pecans, a smell that made her assistants comment the next morning about how wonderful the kitchen had smelled even from outside. While the pies baked, Dinah cleaned every trace of the oleander powder from her workspace, washing bowls and utensils with obsessive thoroughness, disposing of the empty jar by breaking it into pieces and burying them in the kitchen garden. By midnight, all 50 pies sat cooling on racks, perfect and deadly, and Dinah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Her daughter would be avenged. The system that had destroyed her family would receive a blow it would never forget. Justice was coming, measured in heartbeats, delivered in sweetness and poison. She slept poorly that night, her mind cycling through the plan repeatedly, checking for flaws, preparing for contingencies. When she woke on June 14th, her hands were steady and her mind was clear. This was the day she had lived for since January. The day that would define the rest of her life, however long or short that might be. She dressed with care, wrapping her tignon in the African style her mother had taught her decades ago, a small act of reclamation. She walked to the kitchen in the pre-dawn darkness and began the final preparations for the wedding feast, working alongside Lily and Sarah, who had no idea they were participating in the last meal their masters would ever eat. The day proceeded in a blur of activity, food being transferred to the ballroom, tables being set, final touches being applied to decorations, guests beginning to arrive from mid-afternoon onward. Dinah moved through it all like a ghost, present but separate, watching the white people celebrate their wealth and power and certainty, knowing that in a few hours their world would collapse. The wedding ceremony took place at 4 o'clock in the grand parlor of the big house, with 200 guests witnessing as Reverend James Morrison joined Nathaniel Beaumont Whitfield Jr. and Savannah Marie Pemberton in holy matrimony. Dinah watched from the hallway, present, because she was needed for immediate food service, but invisible to the guests who did not register her existence. She saw Nathaniel in his formal suit, handsome and smiling, placing a ring on his bride's finger and kissing her to enthusiastic applause. She saw Master Whitfield beaming with pride at his son's success, saw Mistress Magnolia weeping decorative tears, saw Judge Pemberton looking satisfied with the alliance he had secured through his daughter's sale. She saw wealth and power consolidating itself, confident in its immortality, and she felt nothing except cold determination. In 4 hours, they would all be dead, and the thought sustained her through the ceremony and the immediate aftermath as guests moved into the ballroom for the reception. The ballroom was spectacular, exactly as Mistress Magnolia had envisioned. 3 massive chandeliers cast golden light across polished floors. White flowers, magnolia, gardenia, jasmine, filled every corner with heavy perfume. Tables covered in imported linen held place settings of fine china and crystal. A raised platform at one end of the room accommodated the orchestra, and windows along both walls stood open to catch any breeze that might cut through the June heat. 200 guests in their finest clothes filled the space with conversation and laughter, the sound of a social class celebrating its own dominance. Enslaved workers moved through the crowd serving champagne and hors d'oeuvres, rendered invisible by practice and social convention, carrying trays of food prepared by Dinah's hands. She herself was positioned in the kitchen corridor, adjacent to the ballroom, supervising the service, ensuring every course met her standards, waiting for the moment when dessert would be served and her vengeance would begin. Dinner was called at 6:30, and guests found their assigned seats at tables arranged throughout the ballroom. The meal proceeded in multiple courses: oysters, soup, salad, fish, sorbet, beef, vegetables, a pause for toasts. The food was universally praised as the finest anyone had ever eaten, with multiple guests seeking out Master Whitfield to compliment him on his cook's extraordinary skill. Whitfield accepted the praise as though he had personally created the dishes, and Dinah heard him through the open door, telling a senator that properly trained slaves were capable of remarkable things under correct supervision. She listened without expression, waiting, watching the clock on the ballroom wall advance toward 8 o'clock. Nathaniel and Savannah sat at the head table, holding hands for the audience, playing their roles as the perfect young couple, beginning a perfect life together. Nathaniel was already drunk on champagne, and Dinah saw him whisper something to his new bride that made her blush and look away. She wondered if Savannah would understand before she died that she had married a monster, or if she would die still believing in the fairy tale. At 8:15, Dinah gave the signal to begin serving dessert. The 50 pecan pies were carried into the ballroom on silver trays, each pie cut into 8 slices, 400 pieces total for 200 guests, 2 slices per person, with some extra for second servings. The pies were distributed systematically, working from the head table outward, ensuring that Nathaniel and Savannah received their slices first as the guests of honor, ensuring that Master and Mistress Whitfield at the same table received theirs simultaneously, ensuring that Judge Pemberton and his wife and all the other primary targets were served within the first 5 minutes. Dinah watched from her position in the doorway as the poisoned dessert was consumed, watched as guests took their first bites, and their faces registered pleasure at the perfect balance of sweet and nutty, watched as forks moved to mouths carrying death in every bite. Nathaniel finished his slice quickly and asked for a second, which was brought to him with a smile by a servant who had no idea what he was delivering. Within 20 minutes, at least 150 guests had consumed significant portions of pie, and Dinah permitted herself a moment of deep satisfaction. It was done. Justice was served. Now came the waiting. The symptoms began at 9 o'clock, which was earlier than Dinah had calculated, but not surprising given the high concentration of poison. The first person to show visible distress was Senator Marcus Caldwell, who stood suddenly from his table and vomited onto the floor in front of horrified guests. Within 5 minutes, a dozen others were experiencing similar symptoms: nausea, dizziness, profuse sweating, rapid heartbeat. The orchestra stopped playing as confusion spread through the ballroom. Guests were calling for water, for physicians, for help understanding what was happening. Master Whitfield stood and tried to take control of the situation, shouting for someone to fetch Dr. Morrison from town, demanding to know if the food had been contaminated somehow. Dinah remained in the doorway watching the chaos accelerate, noting that Nathaniel was among those showing symptoms. He had gone pale and was gripping the table for support, while Savannah clutched his arm in terror. Perfect. She wanted him conscious enough to know he was dying, wanted him to feel fear before the end came. By 9:30, the ballroom had descended into complete pandemonium. At least 50 people were actively sick, vomiting or collapsed on the floor, or seized by convulsions. The orchestra had fled, enslaved workers had abandoned their posts, and the remaining healthy guests were trying to help the afflicted while simultaneously panicking about their own fate. Dr. Morrison arrived and immediately recognized that he was looking at mass poisoning, but he had no idea what specific toxin was involved or how to treat it. He moved from patient to patient, checking pulses and symptoms, his face growing increasingly grim as he realized the scope of the disaster. Overseer Crenshaw appeared in the ballroom, demanding to know what had happened, and when someone explained that the food must have been poisoned, he immediately knew where to look. He shoved through the crowd toward the kitchen corridor, looking for Dinah, finding her exactly where she had been standing for the past hour. Their eyes met, and in that moment he understood completely. He reached for his whip, but he never drew it, because at that instant his own symptoms hit. The pie he had eaten 45 minutes earlier was finally entering his system. He staggered. His face went grey, and he fell to his knees, vomiting blood. Dinah walked past him without a second glance, moving through the ballroom toward the exit. No one tried to stop her, because everyone was too occupied with dying or trying to help the dying. She walked calmly through the chaos, observing the results of her work. Senator Caldwell was dead already, sprawled across a table, with blood running from his nose and mouth. Judge Hampton was seizing violently on the floor, while his wife screamed for help that would not come. Master Whitfield had collapsed in his chair, clutching his chest and gasping for air, while Mistress Magnolia knelt beside him weeping and begging him not to leave her. Judge Pemberton was dead, his face frozen in an expression of complete shock. His wife Constance had dragged herself toward the door before succumbing to convulsions that snapped her spine. The physicians who had experimented on slaves were dying side by side, their medical knowledge useless against a poison they could not identify. The newspaper editor who had defended slavery was choking on his own blood, trying to speak but producing only wet, gurgling sounds. On and on across the ballroom, Mississippi's elite writhed in agony or lay still in death, and Dinah felt nothing except a sense of completed purpose. She found Nathaniel near the head table, and she allowed herself to stop and witness his final moments. He was conscious but barely, his face covered in sweat and vomit, his body convulsing periodically. Savannah lay dead beside him. Her smaller body weight meant the poison had killed her faster. Nathaniel's eyes found Dinah's face, and she saw recognition there, saw him understand who had done this and why. She leaned down close to his ear and spoke softly enough that only he could hear over the screaming and chaos filling the ballroom. She told him her daughter's name, told him that Chloe was waiting for him in whatever hell existed beyond death, told him that every person dying in this room was paying for his crime and the crimes of everyone like him. She told him she hoped his death was agonizing, hoped he felt every second of it, hoped the last thing he saw before darkness took him was her face smiling. Then she straightened up and walked away, leaving him to die alone, as he had left her daughter to die alone in that barn 5 months ago. She exited the ballroom through the main doors and walked across the lawn toward the slave quarters, still moving calmly, still showing no outward emotion. Behind her the screaming continued, punctuated now by the sounds of hooves as messengers rode toward Natchez to summon help that would arrive far too late. She reached the edge of the quarters where Isaac waited with 5 horses stolen from the Pemberton plantation stables. Their own masters were dying and would need them no longer. Clara, Moses, Ruth, and Benjamin were already mounted, holding the extra horses ready to run. Dinah climbed onto the last horse without looking back at the big house or the ballroom or any of it. Isaac looked at her and asked a question without words, and she nodded once. They had succeeded beyond measure. Now came survival. They rode west into darkness, following the route Clara had mapped over months of secret scouting. They avoided main roads, cutting through cotton fields and pine forests, using the stars to navigate. Behind them, Willowbrook Plantation burned. Someone had either deliberately set fires or knocked over candles during the chaos, and the big house was being consumed by flames that would be visible for miles. Dinah looked back once at the orange glow against the black sky and felt something she had not felt since January. Peace. Her daughter was avenged. The system had been wounded. Whether they escaped or were captured no longer mattered because she had already won. But still she rode, because if she could be free, if she could make it north and tell this story, if she could ensure that the South knew a slave woman had destroyed its most powerful families, then the victory would be complete. They rode through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses, covering 30 miles before dawn. At first light, they abandoned the horses and continued on foot into the Homochito National Forest, where the dense vegetation would make tracking difficult, even with bloodhounds. They moved in single file, Moses and Clara leading because they knew the wilderness, Benjamin bringing up the rear to watch for pursuit. They walked for 3 days, eating berries and roots Clara identified, drinking from streams, sleeping in shifts with one person always on watch. They heard the bloodhounds twice in the distance, but managed to stay ahead by moving through water whenever possible, and using techniques Clara had learned from other escaped slaves, carrying onions to mask their scent, doubling back on their trails, splitting up briefly to confuse the dogs before reuniting at predetermined points. On the 4th day, they reached the Mississippi River north of Natchez, finding it exactly where Clara had promised it would be. They stole a small boat from a dock outside a river town, taking it at night while the owner slept. They rowed north using the current to help them, staying close to the western bank where Louisiana's swamps provided cover. They traveled only at night, hiding during the day in canebrakes and cypress groves, living on catfish Moses caught with lines made from stolen thread and hooks fashioned from bent nails. They passed plantations where slaves worked in the fields, and Dinah wondered if those people had heard what happened at Willowbrook, if the story had spread yet, if it had given anyone else hope that resistance was possible. They saw river traffic, steamboats and flatboats and ferries, and avoided all of it because any white person who saw 6 slaves traveling together without papers would raise alarms immediately. After 12 days, they crossed into Arkansas, then continued north toward Missouri and the ambiguous status of a border state where slavery existed, but enforcement was less absolute than in the Deep South. Near Cairo, Illinois, they made contact with the Underground Railroad through a network Clara had heard about in coded spirituals sung in the slave quarters. A Quaker family operating a station hid them in a false-bottomed wagon and transported them further north to Indiana, then to Ohio, then finally to Canada, after 6 weeks of terrified travel through territories where they could be captured at any moment under the Fugitive Slave Act. They crossed into Canada on a rainy night in August of 1856, and for the first time in all their lives, they stood on soil where slavery was illegal, where they were recognized as human beings under law, where no one could legally drag them back into bondage. They wept together in the rain, all 6 of them, releasing decades of accumulated trauma and terror and grief. They had survived. Against all odds and all reason, they had survived. Dinah settled in a community of escaped slaves outside Toronto, finding work as a cook in a restaurant where her skills were appreciated and compensated with actual wages she could spend as she chose. Isaac found work as a blacksmith. The others scattered to different cities and jobs, staying in contact through letters written by people they paid to write for them, since none of them could read. They built new lives in freedom, married or stayed single by choice, had children they could raise without fear of separation, grew old in a way enslaved people rarely did. But Dinah never forgot what she had done, and she never regretted it. She told her story to abolitionists who visited the community, giving testimony that was published in anti-slavery newspapers and distributed throughout the North. She described in detail what slavery had taken from her and what she had taken back, refusing to sanitize or apologize, insisting that white audiences understand that violence was the inevitable response to violent oppression. The massacre at Willowbrook Plantation on June 14, 1856, killed 13 people in the ballroom. The bride, the groom, both sets of parents, the overseer, the senator, 3 judges, 2 physicians, and a newspaper editor. Another 7 died over the following week from poison consumed in smaller quantities, including several children whose parents had shared their dessert. The fire that burned down the big house killed 3 enslaved workers who had been trapped inside trying to rescue their master's possessions at his orders. The total death toll reached 23, making it one of the deadliest acts of slave resistance in American history. The response was immediate and brutal. Mississippi implemented even harsher slave codes, executed 5 random slaves in Adams County as collective punishment, and offered a reward of $5,000 for information leading to Dinah's capture. The reward was never claimed because no one betrayed her, and she lived in Canada until her death from natural causes in 1874 at age 56. The story of the wedding saboteur spread through the slave networks like wildfire, carried in whispered conversations and coded spirituals, becoming legend before it became history. In Louisiana, a woman named Marie poisoned her master's entire family 3 months after hearing the Willowbrook story. In Alabama, a group of field hands burned a plantation house with the owners locked inside, explicitly citing Dinah as inspiration. In South Carolina, an enslaved cook named Hannah poisoned a dinner party, killing 7 guests, leaving a note that read simply, "For Dinah." The pattern repeated across the South. Enslaved people who had lived in terrorized submission suddenly saw that resistance was possible, that intelligence and planning could overcome superior force, that the system was not as invincible as it pretended. Slaveholders across the region became paranoid about their food, hired tasters, replaced enslaved cooks with white ones, installed locks on kitchens, lived in constant low-level fear that their own property might murder them. The fear was justified. Between 1856 and the Civil War's start in 1861, documented poisoning incidents on plantations increased by 300%, and the actual number was certainly higher because many cases were covered up to avoid inspiring copycat attacks. Historians would later debate whether Dinah's actions were justified, whether mass murder could be considered legitimate resistance, whether the ends justified the means. These debates took place primarily among white scholars who had never experienced slavery, who could afford to philosophize about violence from the safety of freedom. For enslaved people and their descendants, there was no debate. Dinah had done what the system forced her to do, had used the only tools available to her, had struck back against oppressors who provided no legal recourse for justice. She became a folk hero in black communities, her story passed down through generations, remembered in songs and stories that preserved the truth even when official history tried to erase or minimize it. School children in the 20th century would learn sanitized versions of slavery that omitted resistance and violence. But in black homes and churches, the real stories were told. Dinah, Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser, and countless others whose names were lost but whose courage was remembered. The Willowbrook Plantation was sold by the Whitfield estate to settle debts, purchased by a family from New York who relocated to Mississippi seeking cheap land. They rebuilt the big house and continued operating the plantation with enslaved labor until emancipation in 1865. After the Civil War, the land was broken up and sold to former slaves during Reconstruction, though most of it was later reclaimed by white landowners during the backlash that destroyed Reconstruction's promises. Today, the site is unmarked. No historical marker acknowledges what happened there, and most local residents have never heard the story. But descendants of the enslaved community that survived Willowbrook keep the memory alive, gathering each June 14th to honor Dinah and Chloe, to remember what was taken and what was reclaimed, to ensure that the story is never forgotten. The wedding massacre served as ammunition for abolitionists in the North, who argued that slavery was inherently unstable and violent, that a system based on brutality would inevitably produce brutal resistance, that the South was sitting on a powder keg that would explode if slavery was not ended. Frederick Douglass referenced the Willowbrook incident in multiple speeches, framing Dinah as someone who chose death over submission, who demonstrated the intelligence and capacity for planning that racists insisted enslaved people lacked. John Brown, planning his raid on Harper's Ferry 3 years later, cited examples like Willowbrook as evidence that enslaved people were ready to fight for freedom if given weapons and leadership. Southern politicians responded by doubling down on slavery's defense, insisting that incidents like Willowbrook proved that African people were naturally violent and required enslavement for public safety, a circular logic that blamed victims for responding to their own oppression. The Civil War that began in 1861 was fought officially over secession and union, but at its core, it was fought over slavery and the question of whether human beings could be property. Dinah did not live to see the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 or the 13th Amendment in 1865, but she knew before her death that slavery's end was coming, that the system she had wounded was finally collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions and the force of armed resistance. When she died in Toronto in 1874, she was surrounded by her found family, Isaac and the others who had escaped with her, friends she had made in freedom, people who loved her not as property, but as an equal. She was buried in a small cemetery outside the city, her grave marked with a simple stone that read her name and dates, and below that, a single word chosen by Isaac: free. What can we learn from Dinah's story in our present moment? We learn that oppression always produces resistance, that human beings will only endure brutality for so long before striking back, that systems built on violence contain the seeds of their own destruction. We learn that intelligence and planning are weapons that cannot be confiscated, that the oppressed are always watching and calculating even when they appear submissive, that underestimating people because of their social position is a fatal mistake. We learn that justice delayed is not justice at all, that when legal systems protect abusers rather than victims, people will create their own justice outside those systems. We learn that slavery was not some abstract historical institution, but a daily lived horror that destroyed families and souls, and that the people who survived it and resisted it deserve to be remembered as heroes rather than victims. Dinah's story is uncomfortable because it forces us to confront questions we prefer to avoid. Was she a murderer or a freedom fighter? Can violence be justified when it targets oppressors? How many innocent deaths are acceptable in pursuit of justice? These questions have no simple answers, and perhaps that discomfort is the point. We should be uncomfortable when contemplating the full reality of slavery and its legacies, uncomfortable enough to commit to ensuring nothing like it ever happens again. The system that murdered Chloe and broke Dinah and enslaved millions was built by choices, maintained by choices, and could have been ended by choices long before it took a civil war to destroy it. The people who chose to maintain slavery, who profited from it, who defended it, who participated in it, they bear responsibility for every act of resistance it produced, including Dinah's terrible justice on that June night in 1856. We remember Dinah not because violence is admirable, but because resistance is necessary, because submission to evil is itself evil, because some battles cannot be won through peaceful means no matter how much we wish otherwise. We remember her because the system tried to erase her, tried to pretend she never existed, tried to maintain the fiction that enslaved people accepted their bondage peacefully. We remember her because her intelligence and courage challenge every racist assumption that justified slavery and continues to justify inequality today. We remember her because Chloe deserved a mother who fought for her, and Dinah gave her daughter the only justice available in a world that offered none. We remember her because forgetting is another form of violence, and truth is the foundation of any genuine healing. The wedding at Willowbrook Plantation, that should have celebrated the union of two powerful families instead, became a massacre that demonstrated the fragility of power built on oppression. 13 died, eating pecan pie prepared by hands they had never valued, poisoned by intelligence they had never acknowledged, killed by a woman they had never seen as fully human. Their deaths sent shockwaves through the South that resonated for years, planting fear in every slaveholder's heart, inspiring hope in every slave's spirit, and hastening the end of an institution that should never have existed. And somewhere in the swamps of Mississippi, if you listen carefully on June nights, you can still hear the echo of that night, screaming and chaos, and the sound of a mother's terrible love taking whatever vengeance a brutal world permitted. Remember Dinah. Remember Chloe. Remember that every system of oppression contains the seeds of its own destruction, planted by the hands of those it sought to break but could never fully conquer. Their story is part of America's story, the part we must remember if we are ever to become the nation we claim to be.